Hi, Founder fans. Jason here. A little bit late today, and I apologize for that, but today's founder is Jonathan Grout. Now, Jonathan Grout is a fairly obscure American founder, but had one extraordinarily interesting event in his life, as you probably saw in the thumbnail, involving a telegraph. But we'll get to that. First, Jonathan Grout, as a young man, served in the French and Indian War and established himself as a soldier. After this, he went and studied law in Massachusetts. Now, when the Revolutionary War breaks out, Jonathan Grout goes and actually signs up for the violence and wants to fight. But he's shortly thereafter elected to the Massachusetts General Assembly. And as many people did at the time, he felt it was his duty to stop serving as a soldier and instead serve in the assembly, which he does, and he does fairly successfully through most of the Revolutionary War itself. Of course, after the Revolutionary War ends, Grout goes and helps Massachusetts rewrite a new constitution, and then is elected as a Massachusetts state senator. Now, when the United States Constitution was authored, Grout comes out as a person who's not really for the Constitution. However, he is still chosen as an inaugural member of the United States House of Representatives. That's why when we play trivia on the weekends, his name's always a correct answer. Anyway, he does go as an inaugural member to the House of Representatives, and it's interesting because he's an outspoken anti-federalist at this point. Once the Constitution's ratified, he's no longer an anti-federalist, more of an anti-administration candidate. Now, he is one of only two people that Massachusetts sends to the original House of Representatives who was an anti-federalist. The other being Elbridge Gerry, and Elbridge Gerry, of course, was at the Constitutional Convention and said, "No, I won't sign that," and went home. Now they go, and Grout isn't really a backup player during the first session of the United States Congress. He doesn't speak much. The only time he really takes a stand seems to be when there's a discussion regarding a tax on salt. And he is against taxing salt because he thinks it will unfairly, disproportionately, adversely affect farmers and fishermen, which, of course, living in that part of Massachusetts, as well as New Hampshire, fishing was very important to that part of America in the early days. After his first term, Grout is not reelected. He goes back to his private law practice, but he finds out about something they're doing in France called a visual telegraph system. Now, when you hear the word telegraph, we usually think of the Samuel Morse telegraph, where it's, beep, 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 and that is not what Grout had, because although Ben Franklin had already been doing experiments with electricity, it wasn't quite to that point yet. It would still be another, 40, 50 years before Samuel Morse would invent his telegraph. But the idea of telegraphing a message was not new. And Jonathan Grout hears about what they're doing in France. And what they're doing in France, the visual telegraph system, essentially, there were a series of towers that would have arms built out of them. And these arms would be positioned in a way to signal a message to the next tower. They use what's called a semaphore code. I think I'm pronouncing that right. Semaphore code, which is when you're usually associated with using flags to send a message. Think of the Beatles' Help album. On the cover of that, when they spell out help, you can spell out SOS, you can spell out essentially anything. And what they did is these towers, and Grout would mimic this himself. The towers would send this message based on where they were positioned, and someone at the next tower would look through a spyglass, see the message, position their tower the same way, and to the next tower, and so on and so forth to send a message. So Grout not only gets permission from the state of Massachusetts, but actually gets financial assistance from the state of Massachusetts to set this up. Not so much as a defensive measure as you might initially think, but actually as to help with shipping imports into Boston. And they set up a series of towers from Martha's Vineyard all the way to Boston, and the towers would send this message from Martha's Vineyard to Boston, a distance of 70 miles, and they would send the information in just 10 minutes. Which is an incredible feat. Now, I'm not sure how fast horses run, but they don't run 60 miles an hour, and they would have to run 60 miles an hour for that message to make it from Martha's Vineyard to Boston in 70 minutes, over an hour. So really, on horseback, that message would travel probably about 2.5 hours. And the point was, when a ship came in, they can send a message to Boston and the merchants who own the ships in Boston saying, "Hey, what do you want us to do?" And they can send a message back and say, "Okay, go here, or we'll meet you at this time," or, the harbor's a little crowded here, go to this dock, things of that nature. Because additionally, sailing into Boston Harbor, past Charleston, there was a risk of hitting rocks in the water. It wasn't all that deep, so you didn't want it to be too crowded with ships. And essentially, what Grout's Telegraph does is, in a matter of half an hour, a message could be sent to Boston and back to the ships that instructed them what to do, when that round trip would have taken at least 5 hours with the fastest horses at the time. And this was revolutionary. They would be implemented elsewhere in the United States, so not to this degree. And again, it would only be about 50 years before Samuel Morse comes around with his telegraph, which obviously revolutionized the game. But that's essentially a wrap-up of Jonathan Grout and his very, very, very interesting telegraph, which when we play trivia on Fridays, every time Grout's name comes up, I throw out, oh, he made a telegraph. And I figured today I should explain what I'm talking about with that telegraph. I hope you found it as fascinating as I did, because it is one of those weird stories of the Revolution that in particular I just can't get enough of. So if you like this, make sure you hit like. If you're new here and you want to learn about the American Revolution 5 days a week, hit subscribe. I'll be back to you with another founder tomorrow.